Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you with us as we launch LaingBuisson's Children's Services UK Market Report. I think it really sort of demonstrates how important Children's Services is that we have so many people with us today and how much interest there continues to be in the sector. Before we get started, I'd like to begin by thanking CareTech for the sponsorship of this report and for partnering with us on today's webinar. My name is Tim Reed. I'm the author of the Children's Services Report. I've spent the last 15 years working across social regulation and policy in both the public and private sectors. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by two speakers who will also be bringing with them a wealth of expertise to offer their perspectives, who I'll introduce to you in just a moment. Can we go to the next slide, please, Jade? So, yeah, we're here today to talk about Children's Services UK Market Report. With me, I have Jeremy Wiles, who joins us from CareTech, where he is the Executive Director of Children's Services. For those who may be less familiar with the sector, CareTech is one of the largest providers and operates, among many other services, residential children's homes, foster care, and special education provision. And I'm sure he'll be able to provide sort of a really interesting provider's perspective on the sector. And alongside Jeremy, I'll also be pleased to introduce Peter Sandford, who's the Chief Executive of the Children's Homes Association. Peter has been working with providers across the sector for many years and has been engaged in policy discussions at the highest levels. So I think we'd be interested in looking forward to his perspective on some of the policy impacts potentially facing the sector. And just finally, before we get into it, we'll be saving time at the end for an interactive Q&A session. So if you do have any questions that we don't touch on, please submit them via the Q&A button, which you should be able to see at the bottom of the screen, or alternatively upvote those questions that you do want to hear, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So without further delay, if we get into it. So next slide, please. So the last time LaingBuisson published a Children's Services report was in over 2 years ago. So what can you expect from the new one? It's fair to say that a lot has changed in that time. The last report was, of course, published in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this report is to capture the changes subsequently and provide our perspectives on what lies ahead. For those of you who may have previously seen or purchased a LaingBuisson market report into other sectors, it contains the same mix of quantitative analysis and qualitative insight. And in children's services in particular, because it's such a broad sector, dives into 3 key market segments: special education, residential children's services, and foster care. It contains comprehensive data analysis about the market conditions in those sectors, along with up-to-date insights from policy and regulatory impacts on the sector, which any of you engaged with the sector will know there have been substantial policy and regulatory reviews over the last 2 years, which this report dives into, and the potential impacts of the sector. It contains details on the key sector transactions, market concentration growth strategies, along with provider and investor profiles. And of course, it's backed by the fact that LaingBuisson have been working across health and social care to publish analysis and reports for over 30 years. Next slide, please. So what is the key headline takeaway? Well, overall, LaingBuisson has estimated that the UK children's services total market value is 20.5 billion in 2022. So if we break that down by different market segments, we see that the largest single contributor is 6.6 billion within the special education services. Now, wrapping together children and young people's social care services, the overall market value is nearly 14 billion, but it's important to split this down into the key segments. So the biggest standalone segment is spend on safeguarding, where there is a nominal independent sector presence. However, children's residential care and foster care where there is a much larger independent sector presence. We estimate the market value at over 2.4 billion for children's residential care and just under 2.4 billion for foster care services. This represents clear growth in the market since the last report was published over 2 years ago. And whilst methodological changes means it's not possible to make a direct comparison, there is a clear indication of growth, as the last time market value was estimated, it was in the region of 16.6, 16.7 billion. Next slide, please. So England comprises the largest area spend by a considerable margin. And that's also clearly in line with its significantly larger population size compared to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. LaingBuisson that it estimates that it counts for over 83% of the total market value, so just a shade under 17 billion. If we zero in on the independent sector provision element of that, we can also report that that has grown. This is in relation to its overall value, but also it has captured a larger share of the market. So we estimate that the independent sector share is valued at 5.2 billion overall. And this is the first time that LaingBuisson has valued each element of each market segment, where special education, children fostering, and children's residential homes, each of those individual market segments has an independent sector presence valued at over 1 billion each. Each segment of the market has grown since the last report, and it's also worth being aware that the scale of the independent sector presence varies across segments. So within foster care, 50% of the expenditure is on the independent sector, whilst within special education, this drops down to around 26%. So not all of these market segments are alike in terms of independent sector presence. And there are some areas, as I mentioned, safeguarding, where the independent sector presence is relatively nominal. Next slide, please. Diving into more specifically the market segments, starting with special education. Its continued volume growth of education, health and care plans, or EHCPs, that is driving demand. The graphic on screen clearly indicates the surge since 2016 in demand, and this follows the introduction of the education, health and care plans following the Children's Family Act in 2014. Volume growth over the last 5 years has been very strong, and by January 2022, there was a total of over 355,000 children and young people who had been assigned EHC plans. Over the last few years, as I say, growth has been strong. It hasn't actually fallen below 6.9% per year in the last 4 years. Last year, between January 2021 and January 2022, there was a 9.2% increase in volume, and this followed a 10.5% volume uplift in the previous year. Now, given the statutory funding entitlements and the accompanying rights for a child to be educated in an appropriate setting, these plans have been critical in growing the market value, almost exclusively driven by public sector spending. Now, there are policy levers that may seek to slow down growth, but overall, there appears to be little appetite for revisiting the underlying legislation that has driven this demand. Next slide, please. So, independent sector provision has continued to grow to help meet this market demand. It can be seen that there has been a consistent rise in the independent sector penetration over time, from 8.2% in 2007 through to 12.5% in 2022. And to put that in raw volume terms, that equates to over 20,000 children and young people in independent special schools in 2022. Now, as a rule, the independent sector providers have focused on children and young people with higher complexity needs. These may be areas that some local authorities have traditionally found more difficult to find economically viable to provide through in-house provision. There is some evidence that providers are beginning to think about widening their focus, with some looking at the potential of providing support to those with lower complexity needs. Next slide, please. In line with continued volume growth, it's perhaps unsurprising that we've also seen reported spend continue to grow year on year. The high needs budget from central government has been increasing year on year, whilst reported local authority spending reached 5.77 billion in 2021 on special education providers. This is up from just under 4 billion around 5 years before. And at the moment, spend over the last 2 to 3 years has been increasing at a rate of 400 to 500 million per year on special education services. Of course, this does raise questions over sustainability, and it's of course worth noting that even without the public spending pressures brought on from the high inflationary environment, there has been government concern at rising spend in these areas. There are attempts to rein back spending, but the fragmentation of decision-making across local authorities can make central control of cost levers challenging. There is frankly enough here to go into a whole other section on special education funding, which we don't have time to, but if there are any questions you want to ask around it, please do use the Q&A function. And of course, the report goes into more granular detail on public funding and the mechanisms to control spend and their effectiveness. Next slide, please. So looking across to children's social care services and looking at the total volume of looked after children in total, we do see that the number of children in care, those classified as looked after children, dipped in 2021 following over 20 years of growth. Total volumes of the number of looked after children have increased from around 75,000 in 2000 to nearly 105,000 in 2021. It should be noted that the dip in last year's figures was primarily driven by a decline in volume in Scotland specifically, with the English, Northern Irish and Welsh markets seeing another year's rise of the total volume of looked after children. But in Scotland, we see a decline, and that's actually a continuance of a trend that we have seen in Scotland over the last few years, where there was a high of 16,000 looked after children in 2011. That has fallen to around 13,200 today. And it's just worth spending a moment to contextualize the shift in Scotland. There may be people on the call thinking, well, if numbers fall in Scotland, could that suggest a potential decline in other markets? Now, there is no simple answer to that, but there is an argument to suggest what's happening in Scotland is a market corrective to over-reliance on formal care settings as opposed to other approaches to resolving issues for children at the age of care. And the reason that I say that is that even in 2021, after several years where the number of looked after children have declined, the percentage of under 18s classified as looked after children in Scotland remains higher than it does in England, Wales, or Northern Ireland. So it may be the case that these volume declines in Scotland are not sort of indicative of a trend towards moving away from this historic over-reliance and may not presage a shift or a decline in other markets. That will remain to be seen. Next slide, please. So looking at England in specifically, where have these children, these looked after children tended to be placed over the last decade? We see the bulk of growth within foster care, which makes sense, as ideally local authorities should be looking towards foster care settings as one of the more appropriate settings for looked after children, as it aims to create a more familial environment. Children's homes are of course necessary, but commissioners are less likely to look at them as a first option unless there are strong reasons to do so. However, we do see stronger growth in children's home volumes over the last 5 years. And this may represent some underlying drivers around recruiting challenges for suitable foster carers, which may have pushed commissioners towards other placement options and driving demand within children's homes, or it may alternatively partly be reflective on increasing complexity, challenging nature, or some of the placements for children moving into the looked after child status. The only area that has notably declined is that class as living independently. And here I just want to be clear what we mean by this. This doesn't refer to what we may have previously called semi-independent living or supported accommodation. Those types of accommodation are actually reported under residential settings. So that is potentially sort of slightly misleading part of public sector data reporting. But children living independently has declined over the last 5 years. We know there's a lot of interest in changes in the supported accommodation sector, and it's something that we do touch on in more detail in the report, and I'm sure that we'll be talking to later on. Next slide, please. The next few slides reflect on the extent of independent sector provision within residential and foster care segments. So within residential, children's residential homes, first of all, the independent sector has become a critical element of children's services provision over the last 10 years. Even back in 2009, 62% of placements were with the independent sector providers, and that has continued to increase to reach nearly 85% in 2020, 2021. In terms of a volume shift, that is from just over 5,000 places in 2009 to over 10,000 in 2020. Next slide, please. Similarly looking at the foster care perspective, there remains here the dynamics are different. There remains a strong public sector presence, with the independent sector being responsible for 37% of placements since 2021, and a broadly continuous growth over the last 10 or so years. What we have seen is really a flatlining of local authority provision over that time. In 2020, there were only 500 more local authority placements in 2020 than there were in 2012, whilst in the independent sector, there were foster care placements had increased by 7,000 over the same period. Next slide, please. So moving on from placements to expenditure and jumping back to children's residential homes, we are seeing the expenditure on private sector provision continue to increase. By 2020, 2021, it had reached over 1.3 billion per year. This is compared with 480 million spent on local authority provision. This reflects more than 500 million additional spend on the independent sector since 2016-17, when spend was a shade under 800 million per year. It is, of course, worth noting that although there is a high level of spend within the sector, around 75%, the independent sector is also responsible for 85% of the placements. So although there are, of course, occasional headlines around the cost of provision, it could remain the case that the independent sector offers value for money alternatives to commissioners who may be struggling to find local in-house provision. Next slide, please. And then moving over to foster care, we see that there has again been year-on-year growth on the independent sector spend since 2016-17, reaching 905 million in 2020-2021. Of course, the dynamics here are somewhat different, as I said previously, and spend on independent foster agencies represents closer to 50% of spend on foster care than the much higher levels than it does in residential children's homes. Next slide, please. So moving on to policy and regulation. Now, the last couple of years has seen some important policy reviews take place across the sector and regulatory activity. Primarily on the children's social care side, you have the independent review of children's social care, along with the CMA market study into children's homes and foster care. These are big, major sort of documents, the CMA market study perhaps being most eye-opening for its suggestion of a potential market oversight regime for children's homes. It did suggest it wasn't necessary for foster care, but when the independent review of children's social care came out, it took on board the CMA suggestion for market oversight for children's homes, but also suggested it could be relevant for foster care. These documents contain a lot more impact sector. We can talk about them more in the Q&A, and the report goes into a lot more detail on them. I think what is important to note from this perspective as well is thinking about the barriers to change as well. So in the short term, will the current political environment really have a headspace for change? That we are getting into general election thinking and territory, thinking about manifestos. Is there political will to tackle these issues alongside everything else the government has to think about? Does it really sit as a ministerial priority? And then on a more pragmatic level, if these were taken forward, where is the capacity and headspace for local authorities to really tackle some of these policy implementation changes? Next slide, please. So quality in the independent sector remains high. We see across the different segments, the vast majority of providers are providing good or outstanding quality of services. These are all regulated by Ofsted, although some may also have dual CQC registration. Inadequate providers remain low, a higher 4% among independent special schools and colleges, and 2 to 2.7% in children's homes and fostering agencies. I think it is worth noting that there has been a slight dip in the quality of children's homes over the last year if we compare year-on-year quality ratings. However, that dip in children's home quality isn't just specific to the independent sector. If you look at local authority provision as well, you will also see a dip in quality over the last year. And that may relate to the challenges of, say, maintaining an outstanding rating with all the challenges put forward by COVID on staffing and support. And equally, it may be that those on the edge of requires improvement good kind of slip back into requires improvement because maintaining that quality during the pandemic proved so challenging. So it remains to be seen whether that's a shift in the sector's quality ratings or something which will bounce back in the next couple of years. Next slide, please. So moving on to looking at activity in the sector, we see over time that the sector has remained attractive to investors. There remains a lot of investment activity, and there has been over the last decade a broad trend in increasing EBITDA multiples on transaction values where they are known. Of course, multiples are related very specifically to particular asset and the opportunity it provides, so it's not a hard and fast rule, but I think it does overall paint a picture of a sector that has been attractive to investors over the last decade. And there has been a range of small, mid and large cap private equity and infrastructure companies that have pursued transactions and interest from national and international houses when the right assets have come to market. We see major transactions taking place over the last couple of years, with Arcadia, of course, selling the Priory Group to Waterland. This consisted of a whole spectrum of care crossing adult care and private pay. Since taking over, Waterland has spun off its education division into a standalone business, Asperus, incorporating it with its previous acquisition, Sandcastle Care, and it'll be interesting to see how those dynamics impact on the sector. Of course, the other major activity at the top end was the consolidation of Outcomes First and NFA Group to form Outcomes First Group, immediately creating a much larger market-leading provider, which straddles special education, children's homes, and foster care. But with the smaller end of the sector also remains robust, with plenty of transactions taking place in 2021 and into 2022. Next slide, please. So finally, and I'm conscious that I'm running just over time, looking ahead. Well, but we do see that there continues to be a large amount of market potential. We see this partly in this shift, an increase in market value of around 25% since the last report in October 2020, with growth in all key segments. We see that realistically, there has been a limited evidence of long-term impact of COVID-19 on the sector. And what I mean there is kind of more granular about supply and demand. I'm sure if you, Jeremy will have his own perspective on, and from an operator's perspective on a location by location level, there are, of course, COVID-19 challenges still outstanding. Policy documents look like they would like to shift commissioning up to the regional level. Attempts to do so may change the nature of operational relationships, but realistically are perhaps unlikely to impact on volumes in the medium term due to other supply side constraints in the public sector. Within special education, specifically the challenges in implying constraints on volume growth due to the legislative underpinning of EHCP plans is likely to limit ability to deliver effective top-down interventions on cost control, although I'm sure the government will continue to push hard on local authorities to restrict spend there. Residential children's homes, the scale of private sector provision could make it a target for market oversight, but harder control levers do seem unlikely, with the CMA saying that things like eliminating for-profit provision or profit capping wouldn't be appropriate in the market. Growth opportunities exist in newly regulated supported accommodation market, which I'm sure Peter may speak towards. And in relation to foster care, we have relatively stable market conditions at present, but may have to contend with a larger policy push towards increasing local authority provision. So with that, I think we've sort of come to an end of the key overview of the facts and findings. Just to say that it's now out now. There is a web link to it in the chat. And yes, I mean, if you sort of, for anyone who is interested, I do urge you to seek it out. It is a wealth of facts, figures, and interesting policy and regulatory and provider information. Now, with that feels like a nice segue to introduce our first guest speaker, Jeremy. Pleased to have you with us. I believe that you'll be perhaps providing a provider's eye view of the sector, and I think really interesting to hear what you have to say. So over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning, everyone. And Tim, thank you very much for a great introduction to what I always view as almost the Bible when it comes to facts and figures and market position. So it's a great privilege and a pleasure to be able to sponsor the LaingBuisson 6th edition. A very welcome to have it, and I look forward to thumbing through the finer detail of it shortly. So thank you to that, and I'd also like to thank all stakeholders on the call in any small way that you're touching children's services across the UK. I think we should be very proud of what we do, because making a difference to a child's life is really important. And in some small way, whatever job role you're in or what work you do, to be able to help a child become, be able to fulfill themselves and be the best version of themselves is a great achievement. So thank you to everyone on the call. So yes, my name is Jeremy Wiles. I'm the Group Executive Director for Children's Services at CareTech, operating over 300 registered services across England, Wales and Scotland. Tim alluded to earlier, probably dealing with the much higher acuity end of need in the marketplace. So I just wanted to give a very brief overview as to CareTech's view of the world. First of all, in terms of the current state of the sector, and I say sadly, but the demand for our services is only ever increasing. And the number of children that we've been asked to provide services for is not alarming, but is very, very rich. And I don't see that changing. Every day, the number of referrals we receive outweighs the opportunity we have to place those children in our services. And that's something which I'm not sure whether it's the consequences of the pandemic, but the children that we see, the complexity of needs of these children, I see as only increasing. And I see that increasing year on year to where we are today. And I don't see that changing as we move forwards. So from a company perspective, the current state of the sector as we see it, is very rich in terms of the demand for our services. And our challenge really is how do we mold our services as we move forwards to be able to meet the demand that presents across England, Wales and Scotland. The one part of our business that I think with all providers we have to ask questions about is our foster care side of our business, only in so much as foster parents and their ability or their desire to wish to come and look after children, we see as a continual struggle. We've seen the John Lewis advert making good steps in that direction, but from a foster care perspective, people putting their hands up wanting to look after children, and it might be because of the complexity of needs of these young children, or people rethinking their lives, we see as a challenge as we move forwards. From a funding perspective, we have a lot of interactions with our colleagues in local authorities, and been very supportive to us as an organisation and fellow providers over the last year. Local authorities are very, very aware of the cost challenges and cost pressures on providers, and broadly speaking have been very supportive in terms of how we need to meet our increased costs and how they support us to do that. From a provider's perspective, our single biggest challenge is probably our workforce. Like all parts of the UK, the challenges on workforce capability, and not only the recruitment of workforce, but the retention of our workforce is biggest single ongoing challenge. Ofsted, I believe, have made a good step forward. So now, rather than having to have registered managers for each of our provision, they've now moved to multi-site registration, which has helped us in terms of the leaders of our organisation, because from a provider's perspective, I'm only as good as each home manager that we employ for each of our care homes or each of our schools. And if we get that right, the quality of what we deliver for the children we're blessed to look after, it is born out of them. So multi-site registration has been a big step forward to us. However, the residential support workers, the foster parents, the teaching assistants who work with high acuity need children, our special education needs schools, they're the bread and butter of our business, and that is one of our biggest challenges as we move forwards. That is then a direct link to our quality of our services. We're grateful that the quality of our services currently sits at 80% good or outstanding. I want to be setting the number, the rating for the UK rather than being a follower. So I think we're just slightly above the Ofsted national average at the moment, and everything that I do hopefully will underpin improving the quality of our services as we move forwards. That's a very brief introduction from myself. I'm going to hand over now back to Tim, who's going to introduce Peter.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Much appreciated, and really, really interesting to kind of get that ground level view of what's going on in the sector. Now, before I introduce Peter, I'll just remind everyone that if you do have any questions for us on any aspects of what we've spoken about today, or any other aspects which have come to mind on children's services, to do pop a question in the Q&A and we can pick it up in just a moment. But without anything further, Peter, over to you for your own perspectives on working with providers and at the policy level in the sector.
Hello there, and thank you for that introduction, Tim. My name is Peter Sanderford. I am the Chief Exec of the Children's Homes Association. The Children's Homes Association has only been going 12 months. Prior to that, we were the independent Children's Homes Association, but we have over the last year or two started to welcome the public sector into membership as well. So our membership now crosses public sector, voluntary sector and the private sector. Very much welcome this report, and the stats that are in it are always really helpful when looking at what is happening in the sector and looking to grow. The bit that was very reassuring to me is, as most of you will know, we commission annually from CHA the State of the Sector report. And I think a lot of what is being said here echoes the findings there. So there is very much a consistency in the message. I just want to pick up on 2 or 3 areas that are paramount at the moment as we see it. First of all, recognising the CMA report. We really believe that the CMA rightly focused on commissioning and regulation as key areas impacting on sufficiency, particularly in relation to the need for granular data. And it's that granular data that we need to inform developments of new provision and improve providers' confidence to accept children with complex needs. And I think that is coming through what Tim has described and also what Jeremy talked about. We believe an opportunity to investigate the demand side of the market equation was missing a little bit from that report, though. There are currently a record number of children in care, and what we really need to see is a strategy to reduce that number. And that I really welcome in the next report I'm going to comment on, which is the care review. But it's also something that we recognise as an emphasis on what the Welsh Government are trying to do through their Eliminate programme. I have issues to talk about the Eliminate element, but certainly getting the early intervention right and reducing numbers requiring residential and just general removal from family, from their family of origin would be useful. So from the care review, the voice and experience of experts who care for children with the most complex needs should have been more central. However, there was no representation or experts from the residential childcare involved in any real way, despite really pushing for that. We would expect the review to make very far-reaching recommendations, but we would have expected them to be underpinned by systematic evidence review, and we didn't really see any systematic evidence review. It's worrying that the review proposed the doing away with Regulation 44 and IROs, roles that are key to children's safeguarding, and I really hope that doesn't get taken up by the government. What has been the impact of regional commissioning to date? On what basis should we be developing 20 regional care cooperatives? What we know we need is and what works is relationship commissioning. And what I fear is we will lose that relationship commissioning. But the review was right and is supported again by the CMA. We do need to look at how commissioning is being done. The third one I wanted to look at was the eliminate profit in Wales. And just some key points. Providers of Children's Home Wales, like in England, are judged as providing good services, whether they're in the private, voluntary or public sectors. There is in Wales a lack of sufficiency. The CMA says private costs less than public, and that is very much supported by other reports. Welsh Government have invited public and voluntary sector to increase their capacity for the last 5 years, and they haven't done so. The outgoing Children's Commissioner had heard from one young person that they objected to profit being made out of their care. Yet that has been presented as the main reason for doing the Eliminate programme. The launch of policy of this Eliminate policy has stopped investment in growth in Wales, and most private providers are saying they will not transition to not-for-profit. They have invested in their companies and they would lose their investment. And we know that children now are suffering and that is increasing. And from a recent Freedom of Information request, we know that local authorities are significantly increasing their use of unregulated provision in Wales. Before I finish, I want to go to the workforce because it's the workforce that is impacting the most on the growth of sufficiency. And it's how we actually do something about that. because there is a sustained increase in demand for residential placements, but there is a low morale across the children's residential care sector generally. And that's not surprising when you're looking at how the sector is frequently hammered in the media. We don't talk about the successes and what works so well for so many children. Jeremy started his presentation by saying thank you. I echo that to the providers of residential childcare across the 4 nations. We are providing, and the professionals providing it are doing so much there to champion children achieving their ambitions in life. And for the vast majority, that is proving really effective. Just a couple more points before moving on. We really need to look at how we get into recruitment and build on the recruitment. So CHA has recently developed multiple videos about the real aspects of residential care, and these will be launched in January. And we are looking at how we champion registered managers, residential childcare practitioners. We keep talking about care staff. Actually, these are professional people, residential childcare practitioners who are working to support some of the most vulnerable children in society. We need to develop an extensive communication strategy across all media platforms about the value of our provision. That has been missed by successive governments. It was missed throughout COVID. There was not one clap on a Thursday for children's residential care. This is something we need to change, and we need the government to get behind a recruitment campaign that CHA is leading and will be going forward very early in the new year. We also need to work on training and staff development, and that is another element that CHA are working on. And please keep following us and watching what we're doing and joining in the provision we're doing. A final 3 points. We must change the conversation from sector criticism and sniping to have a worthwhile and valuable career working with children in residential care. We must ensure that growth creates capacity that is in line with the needs of children and young people local authorities currently cannot place. And we need to make relationships between commissioners and providers work for the benefits of the children we all care so much about. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for that, and yeah, what important sentiments to sort of which I'd like to echo about sort of thanks to the provider sector for the work that they are doing. And I also think as well, very interesting to hear your perspectives from what's going on in Wales and the ongoing challenge, of course, between balancing kind of policy objectives with kind of political objectives. And I think how Wales plays out will be like, hopefully, of course, smoothly for all the children and workers involved in the sector, but also from the outside, it'd be interesting to see like how successfully the Welsh government may be able to take forward their planned political objectives with a potential provider pushback. Now, as I said, we now have time for a Q&A. So anyone who would like to, please do use the Q&A function in the session on the bottom of your screen. Also, I see there's a couple in the chat, which we'll also come to, but perhaps while people are warming up, I'd like to pose one question to you, Jeremy, first, and one question to Peter. So Peter, I'll give you some thinking time on this. Jeremy, in terms of the independent review, and perhaps even think about saying green paper as well, as a major sector provider, what would CareTech like to see from the government in response to either of those pieces of work? And just before you answer, just to give you a bit of thinking time, Peter, the question I'll pose to you is perhaps in relation to the incoming national standards for 16 to 17-year-olds in supported accommodation, previously semi-independent living, What is your feeling about the appetite from traditional children's home providers about moving into what had previously been a relatively unregulated part of the market? So I'll leave you thinking on that as well. So Jeremy, then back to you. Independent review, send green paper. As a major provider, what would you like to see from the government's response?
Yeah, I think Tim, I think you captured very eloquently the challenges about the current political environment in your introduction. We've got an election probably two years out. Will there be major policy that's going to fall out of where we are today for the future? I'm just not sure there will be. I think the key thing for me across the whole of the UK, and all the reviews that are going on, if there's any way to drive consistency of approach across children's services, I think that has to be a good thing, because every local authority has a different way of looking at the world. Every cluster, and Peter talked eloquently about the procurement hubs, have a different way of looking at the world. Anything that drives increased consistency, conformity, or standardization of approach. Everyone talks about outcomes for children, but everybody looks at outcomes for children in a different way. Children are unique, and an outcome for one child might be different from an outcome from another child. But the ability to be able to drive consistency, common language, and common approach, I think if any way pushes us towards that, I think that's all I'm looking for, because I think anything more than that will be a pipe dream of 5-7 years down the line.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Well, Peter, I saw that you were going to come in on that. So perhaps before moving on to the question I asked you, of course, feel free to take a stab at the question for Jeremy as well.
I would just like to add to what Jeremy was saying there in terms of, instead of outcomes, I think we need to look at the impact we are having on children, and the emphasis needs to be on the difference we're making and the journey travelled for children. Particularly when we're looking at residential care, so many of the children have had multiple family placements, both within their birth families and so frequently in fostering as well, before they arrive in a children's home. And we need to be looking at the impact measures of the services we're providing. And I think that applies as well to fostering provision. So I just wanted to kind of change that emphasis to impact from outcomes. To go now to the 16+ provision, people in this meeting may well be aware that the standards were published last night. I only saw those standards quarter of an hour before this meeting started, so I haven't had a proper chance to review them at all. But certainly from a CHA point of view, we've talked about long and hard and talked with the Department for Education, and we would very much welcome providers into membership once they're registered. CHA is about the registration of provision. We see 16+ as children. Now, I don't believe that people, even when they stop being a child, which technically is 18, stop having care needs. I know I had them for a lot longer. And I know most people at different points in their life have care needs. And to actually put an artificial definition in there is very hard to do. But I do know that a lot of children in children's homes actually want to move on with their lives in a way that they struggle to do within the confines of the children's homes quality standards. So we do need something different. I'm just not sure, having quickly scanned the draft that are out at the moment, whether they clarify enough the difference between having the care needs of a registered children's home and the care needs of a 16+ provision, because many children will need to stay in a registered children's home because they have those care needs.
Peter, that's great, fantastic. Conscious of times, and I'll move on to some of the Q&A questions. So thank you for submitting those. So I think the first one is, let's look at Tracy. I see you've sent through a question. Can you please describe what a well-functioning commissioner provider relationship looks like. And I think it'll be interesting. Both of you, plenty of sector experience. I won't touch it myself. Peter, it was directed to you, but Jeremy, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Peter, first of all, perhaps from you, a well-functioning.
I'm going to quote one that I know Jeremy knows well, because it's one that they're involved in, where there is a relationship between a local authority and a provider, where there is a very much a openness of, we have a vacancy coming up. Would you like to fill it in your local children's home? And the local authority saying to the provider, we anticipate we will have these vacancies in the near future. And it's the closeness of that relationship. And that is something which is growing with other providers now and other relationships. What the difficulty is how you bring that into all the procurement legislation. And at the moment, we're awaiting the new legislation coming out. And at the moment, we don't even know if children's services are going to be part of it. And the problem, I think, at the moment, a lack of direction coming centrally in terms of what is happening for the procurement of services, for the commissioning, and how local authorities and providers will work in the future. There needs to be the good communication, which I think gets lost the more we build artificial groupings of local authorities that we are questionable, which have been effective. Those local authorities have different political mandates for what they're doing and different steers. And yes, I just don't see that effectiveness in there, and haven't seen it across other sectors that have also gone regional routes, like regional adoption agencies in the recent past.
Jeremy, quickly over to you. Have you got like one or two key thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. I think where we've got and across the UK 2 or 3 examples of where commissioners and provider relationship, I think, is really good. We've got a local authority we work with on a risk share basis, where we jointly share the profit we make between these 3 residential care homes and a school. And that works very, very well. And then, as Peter's articulated, we actually have block contract arrangements with some local authorities. And unless we are working hand in glove from a commissioner provider perspective, those don't work. And our experience over the years where we have these running, if they work really, really well. They meet the needs of the local authority. Most importantly, they meet the needs of children. But we have a very profitable, and by profitable, I mean a very simple relationship where we're just pushing in the same direction, and that makes the world so much easier for us.
Great, fantastic. Looking at the Q&A, there are 2 sort of related questions around fostering, which I think I'll look to pair together. So Derek asked, if fostering remains flat, what is the future shape of provision for looked after children, assuming demand continues upwards? And then perhaps somewhat related, is there a wide and joint effort to engage companies such as John Lewis to drive awareness and impact for the sector? Now, to take that first question, we've heard already one of the challenges is recruiting foster carers and recruiting appropriate foster carers for the right type of placement. And I think that there laid out in the independent review is a real call for action for increasing the number of foster carers. So whether that may play out in relation with these kind of joint efforts with companies to provide greater insight, perhaps remains to be seen once we see the government's response to that. Then it's possible more innovative recruitment campaigns are going to be set to take place. Often they are directed at the local level, or historically they have been through local authorities doing their own actions, but we may see a more coordinated national approach to it. Now, of course, if they can't increase the number of foster carers, that kind of is going to be the issue around fostering remaining flat. The independent review looks to place more weight on other family types and networks being more involved in a child's life. That would be at the lower complexity, lower acuity end of the spectrum in all likelihood. So if that is taken forward as a policy goal, what that may do is potentially find a new set of people who may be able to provide care for children, that may relieve pressure on traditional fostering services. But equally, if that doesn't take forward, then of course there may be continued upwards demand for children's homes because the foster care is just not available. So it does revolve around that question of whether we can increase recruitment to the foster sector. Niall Kelly, following the recent closure of some larger residential children's services following regulator action, does the panel see smaller children's homes becoming the norm, which inevitably will drive up costs? So I guess two questions there. First of all, smaller children's homes becoming the norm, and almost the second one, will it inevitably drive up costs? Jeremy, do you have any views on that?
So it would be, is it normal for a child to live in a single home by themselves? I would think probably that's not what people would normally expect. But children tend to live with children. We find that just because of the acuity of young people that are coming through, managing them in a single environment is sometimes easier than a group environment. However, for ourselves personally, we would see a pathway to group living, to what we would articulate a normal family type environment would be good. I think maybe the question that Niall's asking is around registration size, which I think is a different question. And I think that from a regulator perspective, having oversight of 6 children under 1 registration is more palatable than sometimes larger registrations, which are historic, where you might have a single registration over, say, 30 or 40 children. And the regulator might well argue, is that actually viable for a single person to have that level of oversight of that number of children? For ourselves, we're probably looking to reduce the bigger registrations into bite-sized chunks to support that thesis across some of our bigger registrations in our portfolio.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jamie. Really interesting to get the provider side perspective on that. And Peter, perhaps looking more broadly at the same question, smaller children's homes become the norm, and will it inevitably drive up costs?
The average size at the moment is 3 to 4 places in a children's home. There are the outliers that are considerably bigger, and I tend to agree with Jeremy's comment, but there are several very good provision that are around the 10-15 mark, which are tend to be the therapeutic providers, the ones working with various therapeutic models, and they are very effective, broadly speaking. They have a definite model of the way they provide care, and that works. I think we need the balance because we have so many children with so many different needs, and some children require the smaller provision. I'm very cautious about solo occupancy. I believe it may be necessary for a short period of time, but as a place to live for a child, I wonder about it as a long-term provision. But for some children, I am sure it will be the right provision. So I think it's impossible to answer it in terms of a generality because of the very different needs of children and how we need to meet those needs.
Okay, that's great, fantastic. Now, I've been given permission to run a couple of minutes over. I know that many people probably have to drop off, but there were a couple of questions, one submitted in advance and one on the chat around, which is technology based. So I think on a broader sort of sectorial level, we had a question around in which areas of the market will technology disrupt current services and business models over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, that's a broad question, but I think maybe think about it in terms of, do you see technology coming which will affect maybe the actual provision of services? And also, is there technology coming which will support or improve the back office parts of the business, whether that's relationship with commissioners, whether it's regulation, etc.? And then going into a more specific question on the chat, which is around, there's obviously a lot of work around app-based technology that look to put the child's voice at the center, outcomes and impact centered provision. what is perhaps the best way of ensuring that the child's perspective is included within the decision-making process? So one is perhaps a broader question, and one is a more specific question. Again, Jeremy, if I go to you first, and Peter, any reflections as well would be
sure.
Great.
So I'll leave the back office stuff, Tim, because I think that a back office will come. Technology and advancements has to help us. But two very specific things that we're doing at CareTech, which we think will support our children. First of all, we've got we're partnered with an organisation called Mind of My Own, and across all of our services, we use their app to capture the voice of a child, which we think is super important and can only inform us, help best support the needs of young people. And then out with that, we also have an organisation within CareTech called Smartbox. And for children who have communication difficulties, using Smartbox, and we've got 2 Smartbox-enabled special education needs schools now, where the whole school use iPad technology to help communicate, to understand the voice of sometimes an autistic person who is finding it difficult to communicate. So I think technology will only help us reach children and understand children's needs better. And I think moving forwards, where I'm quite excited with what we're doing to be able to really help us feed that back in to the wider population and support more children and listen to what they do.
That's great. Thanks, Jeremy. Peter, any thoughts from you?
I think the use of technology in terms of measuring impact and planning a child's journey in terms of what their needs are and how best to meet them is a useful way forward, and it's making use of that technology, which we know is there now. It's starting to come into use. A growing number of our members are using something called Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths, and I would encourage the continued move in that direction.
Fantastic. So we're going to do 2 very last questions, I think, before we close. This last one, Peter, I think you can maybe not quite as low as a yes, no, but regarding what you're saying in the Welsh Government, what, in your view, is the likelihood they'll be forced to drop the initiative due to the negative impact the plan is, as you mentioned, is already having? So
my worry is that it will carry on right through to the 2027 implementation date, by which time a lot of providers will have either exited or cut their provision, and there will be no growth, and a growing number of children will suffer. There is a consultation that we're waiting for the results of in terms of how they're proceeding with that legislation. I wait with anticipation. Yeah.
I think, Peter, I have to say, I think I probably agree with you, coming from the policy side. These things are often not dropped until long after everyone who actually has to implement them knows that they're not necessarily feasible. So I guess we wait and see on that. And then I think a good one to round things off at is the question of what is the limit of independent sector penetration? And I think the best way to think about this is to think that you can't talk about children's services as a whole when it comes to independent sector provision. You are operating primarily within a market segment. You may operate in multiple market segments, but you are operating in market segments, not across children's services as a whole. So in residential children's homes, penetration is already very high. It may well climb higher due to kind of supply constraints on the local authority side and a lack of ability or desire to sort of get into the provision of complex children's care. But as I say, penetration is already high, and there will be people on the political side who thinks it's already too high and may look to invest in the sector to kind of keep it balanced. For foster care, I think we'll continue to see a relatively strong amount of local authority provision, but it's already shown that the independent sector is chipping away at that and beginning to increase its market share slowly over time. And over the next 5 years, I would continue to see steady growth, although but there may be wider changes depending on how the government chooses to take, and maybe a Labour government chooses to take forward its response to the independent review. And then within special education, currently independent sector provision is much lower. I think it'll be much harder for the independent sector to grow very strongly in this area, purely because they have tended to operate within the higher acuity complexity end of the spectrum. There is only ever going to be so much volume demand at that point, and there are different challenges and issues with running larger, lower complexity, more mainstream special provision schools. Now, that's not to say that it's not possible, that it's not an area for growth, but I think that commissioners may be less likely to sort of make use of those areas. Independent sector providers may see that there's more risk attached to investments in those areas. So I wouldn't expect to see growth up to the level that we've seen it for residential children's homes, and certainly not within the next 10 years when it comes to that. So we have run over time. I want to thank everyone for joining with us today, and really appreciate that so many of you have stayed over time. I'd like to offer my thanks to Peter and to Jeremy for their incredibly interesting perspectives and expertise on what is going on in the sector. Thank you for your questions. Thank you again to CareTech for sponsoring the report and partnering with us on the webinar. And for all of those who are interested, the Children's Services report is now live. So I do urge you to either speak to your LaingBuisson representatives, go to the website and have a look at it. Okay, so thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today about the market report.